Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I am Adrian and this is Rabona TV, of course, and what a special video we have for you today. Herculez Gomez, former US men's national team player, two-time MLS Cup winner, winner of league titles in Mexico with Puebla and Santos Laguna. Now, he's a pundit for ESPN, speaking regularly on ESPN FC, of course, but most prominently on Futbol Americas with Sebastian Salazar. If you don't have ESPN Plus, you can always listen on the podcast platform of your choice. But anyway, today we're going to cover a few things contributing to this dip in form for Mexico, this dip in dominance, if you will. Sound good? I won't hold you back any further. Except, hey, if you're new here and you enjoy this conversation with Herc, consider subscribing. All right, let's go. There's no question that Mexico has produced great talent over the years. That has translated to some great achievements at the youth levels. I mean, they've won almost every single CONCACAF Under-17 championship that I was looking at. They've taken part, the ones that they've taken part in, of course. They've also won the U17 World Cup on a couple of occasions. So they've taken their success to an international level, at least in the youth competitions, and the Olympics, I should say, as well. But when it comes to the senior side, beyond CONCACAF competitions, they struggle on the international stage. So Herc, why is it that they can have such great elite talent at a youth level, but when they get to the World Cup, it just doesn't translate to the same level of success?
If you look at Mexico and the way they operate, the way they work with their fuerzas básicas, the academies, the structure that they have, the infrastructure, I should say, it's unbelievable. They really are a world power. They operate at a world power level. From coaching, from the academy system, from the time you're able to touch a ball and you're in a town like Torreon, for example, when I played at Santos, everybody there wants to play. If you're a male between the ages of 4 to 18, your goal is trying to play in the first team for Santos Laguna. That's just the way it is. It's part of the culture, part of the fabric of everyday life. So when you have that type of, ability to captivate somebody, to draw them in, it's powerful. So every single day, that's all they do. If they're on the streets, if they're at school, if they're in an actual academy program, their minds are on, I want to play. And as soon as you get into this structured program, well, they want to produce players. They want to produce the best players in the area, the best players in the nation, the best players in CONCACAF. And that's what they do. It's a factory. A lot of these clubs, they spend top dollar on their youth. What happens is they get to a certain level, whether it's 16, 17, 18, and they start getting these first team looks and stepping into the first team with the idea of not so much playing these players, having them have a certain cachet about them where they're now first team players so they can sell them. And if they don't get sold immediately, they kind of fall off, because in Mexico, it's not like the Premier League. It's not like La Liga, where there's a certain amount of parameters for foreign players. Like in the Premier League, you have to play a certain amount of minutes from whatever your category A or B, C national team is to get a work permit. In Spain, you're allowed 3 foreigners. In Mexico, you used to be allowed 4 foreigners. Now you can have as many foreigners as you want, as long as there's only 9 on the game day roster. So every foreigner you bring in theory, is one less position for a Mexican player. So if 9 could be on the game day roster, that leaves out 9 Mexican players. And those ages between 8 and 22 are the lost years for these Mexican players, because they do great when it comes to a national level, international level, a youth team. But for whatever reason, these teams, they don't like taking those chances on those players. And it's baffling, because if you look at Mexico, they put a pause on promotion relegation. So it's not like you play these young players, you're at risk of getting relegated, which is, a big excuse for a majority of the teams around the world of why they don't not only produce, but give these opportunities to the young players. So it's a combination of all these mixed factors. They're up there with some of the best players in the world when they're 13 to 18 years old, but they don't have the same opportunities after that.
Yeah, it's certainly a puzzling one, and we'll get more into sort of the club side of things, because I think that there's a lot to unpack there. But let's look strictly at the national team for now, the senior national team. And when you look at the last 5 years or so, you consider where some of these guys are playing, the likes of Raul Jimenez, Tecatito, Lozano, Edson Alvarez, even Chicharito was doing his thing with some of the top teams in Europe for a while. Hector Herrera, a guy I can't stand as a Benfiquista, of course, for what he's done for Porto. Compared to the past versions of the Mexican team, at least on paper, you could say that they've never been more relevant, I guess, in the European club football. And I will ask you more about the Liga MX teams. But with all of these players taking part in prestigious leagues abroad, you'd think that their trajectory would be sort of flying. but there's a legitimate
Right.
chance now that they could finish, even third in World Cup qualifying. So what's going on here? Does it come down for you to coaching?
No, not necessarily. I don't think coaching is the issue. Now, when we talk about the trajectory in national team performance, keep in mind that the last 7 World Cups since the 1990 World Cup, or 94 World Cup, Mexico is one of 2 teams that has made it to the second round in every single World Cup it's participated, the other team being Brazil. The problem is that's their tope, as they say. That's the ceiling for them. That's what it's been, because they get knocked out before that 5th game every single time. A lot of that could be seeding. A lot of that could be just misfortune. A lot of that could just be like imploding at the worst possible times, whatever you may want. But since then, teams like South Korea, the United States, Costa Rica, Turkey, Sweden, you can throw in a bunch of different teams that haven't had the same success consistently, who have gotten to that 5th game, that quarterfinal game. So it almost to me seems like a bit of bad luck, a bit of mental block on their part, because the talent is there. This is going on today, and they may be in jeopardy of not winning the octagonal. You look at players like Héctor Herrera, Tecatito Corona, Chucky Lozano. You look at the likes of Eric Gutierrez, who has PSV, Gerardo Arteaga, all these different players who are abroad right now. They're not really getting consistent first team minutes, and some of these players, Guardado's 36, Hector Moreno just came back from Europe. I should say not even Europe. He went from Europe to Qatar to Mexico. Araujo was struggling a bit this year at Celta de Vigo. It seems like even though they're in European teams, you're not getting consistent first team minutes. Hector Herrera is struggling to play at Atletico. So you're not getting enough of your best players to play in form at the right time. So all of a sudden you play against these very young, very dynamic, very hungry teams like the United States men's national team, like Canada, who in transition, plenty of legs, and really take it to you physically, and you're not in form. Well, the game is still 11-11, and the ball still rolls the same way for everybody, but all of a sudden you give life to the opponent and you start doubting yourself, and you're not informed, so you don't have that game sharpness. It was just a bad cocktail waiting to happen for El Tri. That said, they're still 2 points away from first from Canada, 1 point away from the United States men's national team, and 4 of their next 6 games will be at home, and they have a very good home record. So that's 12 points right there if they can win that. And by my calculations, they win those 12 points. I don't see the United States or Canada picking up 12. I think the range, if they're lucky, is about 10 to 11. I think that puts Mexico over the edge, and they'll win the octagonal. That said, this region is definitely evening out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to speak about the strength of the region in a moment here, but just looking at the players abroad versus players playing domestically, we see this all the time when it comes to the U.S. men's national team. There's that ongoing debate of, do you pick the guy who's, a substitute in the Bundesliga,
Right,
for example, over the guy who's doing well in MLS?
right.
Is there a similar sort of narrative that goes on in Mexico as well?
No, it's crazy.
Really?
It's crazy because there's just, maybe the U.S. men's national team is unique in this case because it's not exclusive. If you're a U.S. men's national team fan, it doesn't mean you're also an MLS fan. Do you know what I mean? And the U.S. men's national team doesn't depend for its players to do well first in Major League Soccer and then go abroad. Well, that's the exact case in Liga MX. Like, you have to do well in Liga MX and then go abroad. There are very few cases where a player bypasses Liga MX and goes abroad. Counted cases, like in its history, like, Carlos Vela, that type of case where didn't really play Liga MX. I don't think he ever played first team minutes at Chivas. He went straight abroad. Those are few and far between. The majority go Liga MX, and there's this train of thought that you have to cumplir your procesos, like finish your process, your cycle of a player. So that's why Orbelín Pineda was knocked out of repechaje, the wildcard playing game in Liguilla with Cruz Azul, and he's going to go to Celta de Vigo. He's 26 years old, I believe, in March, and he's going to go to Celta de Vigo just now. Like, they have this idea that you've got to do well or you got to be in Liga MX first. And there's this crazy notion that what we have here in Liga MX is better than Europe. Like, there's, like hey, he's doing well here in Liga MX. He's the MVP of Liga MX, and this guy's struggling in Europe. I'd rather take this guy in Liga MX. And that was said of Luis Romo last year. Like, I'd take Luis Romo over Edson Alvarez, were some of the takes I would get from pundits. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Edson Alvarez he's literally a machine. He's for my money, the best 6 in CONCACAF. And you're talking about taking Luis Romo, who's 25 years old at that time. Now he's 26. Over him, and he's never played first team minutes in Europe. Like, there's this notion that what we have here is just as good as anywhere else.
That's interesting. And do you think that, there's been a lot made of how they make it difficult sometimes for players to go abroad? Like you just said, you can't really bypass the system in a sense. Do you think that has ultimately hurt the national team? Because speaking from my experience, watching Benfica, for example, a team that generates a ton of young talent, oftentimes, like we've seen with Renato Sanchez or even with João Felix, they go away young and then they can't really find their feet again.
Correct.
So I can see how they would look at this way of dealing with the Mexican talent and thinking this is the right way forward. But do you think that ultimately it's backfired in some ways?
Yes, in a lot of ways. You want your best talent, high ceiling abroad at the best level as soon as possible. Sink or swim, and they'll be better for it. Look at Carlos Vela. He sank for a bit, Arsenal, and then he started swimming at Real Sociedad, and he was one of the top 3 players in La Liga in a year that, Messi and Cristiano were there. You were talking about Carlos Vela, Messi, and Cristiano. That's how good he was for about 18 months at Sociedad. He's got that type of level to him. But he struggled a lot at Arsenal, couldn't find his footing. He became better for it. I believe you are better for the circumstances that you experience. The problem is in Liga MX, they don't see it that way. They'd rather have, and they have the buying power to bring these players back. And I'll give you an example. He's not Mexican, but Nico Castillo completely killed it at Pumas, right? He was the top goal scorer in those 3 seasons. Like, overall, he was a madman against, he played for Pumas. He was a madman against America, against Chivas, Cruz Azul, all the top teams. He did well. He went to Benfica for, I believe, half a season, and it didn't go well for him. But here comes Club America, and they're like, I'll give this guy 3-point-something million, bring him back, a year. And this guy's like, I'm going to make more than I make in Europe right now. Net? Yeah, I'll go back. So that happens a lot with Mexican players. And this happened to the U.S. men's national team. And I think it ultimately, this is my take. This is my co-host on Futbol Americas, Sebastian Salazar's take, but I happen to agree with them. MLS had the buying power to bring back Clint Dempsey, Michael Bradley, Josie Altidore. It started bringing back all the major stars for the U.S. men's national team. And ultimately, you could say, well, 2018 didn't go well. Why? There weren't enough of those players at a top optimum level. This is happening as well at Liga MX. They have the buying power to bring back a Carlos Salcedo, a center back, to Tigres. Miguel Layún brought him back. Hector Moreno brought him back. It's like Cesar Montes, who's a top prospect right now. There's no bringing him back. They won't let him go because they paid him so much. They're like, hey, go if you want, but this is the money we're going to give you. And he's like, well, I think I'm going to stay. They've got that buying power. It's really a top earning league, so they can keep those stars. And ultimately, I think that's hurt them.
And so now we're jumping all over the place. I apologize. Scatterbrained approach to this, but let's jump back to the national team now and taking a look at CONCACAF in general. So you sort of mentioned it earlier. Is it just the fact, are we all being overly critical on Mexico? Is this just CONCACAF leveling out and you're seeing emerging not champions? Whoa. Let me not get ahead of myself here. You're seeing emerging countries like Canada come in and sort of be disruptors. Panama even. I think a lot of people are sort of ignoring what Panama is doing because they're right on the heels as well. So are we just being overly critical? And if you don't sing Canada's praises here, I'm going to be very upset.
Listen, I've been singing Canada's praises for a while.
You have.
We're being a little bit of both, Adrian. And why do I say that? Because people expect with the resources that the Mexican Federation has and the culture surrounding the game that they would do better in exporting players because their players are so technically sound, because their players are so involved in the game, because their players can play anywhere in the world. And I'm convinced at that, but they don't go abroad and they're growing stagnant. And the ones who do go abroad aren't doing well for themselves. There are very few who you could say have done well for themselves abroad lately. So then all of a sudden you get a new generation. And by the way, it's an old team, the oldest team in CONCACAF. And then you get a new generation of U.S. men's national team players, the youngest generation, the youngest team, playing in some of the best leagues, some of the best teams in the world. And then you get this Canadian team that's very young, very good pieces, I'm talking about, your Mark Anthony Kay, who's interesting. I'm talking about your Estacio, who's very interesting. He was at Cruz Azul for a bit, and then I think the first game towards ACL, they didn't see the best of him, and all of a sudden this kid's like exploding in Portugal, exploding for the Canadian national team. You got a Jonathan David, who's the best 9 in CONCACAF for my money. You've got a Kyle Larin who can score goals any given day, and then you have the best player in CONCACAF, and Alphonso Davies, who's a madman, who's an animal, and he can completely dominates and takes over any game he plays. He's got that type of impact, and a very well-coached team. So you've got this little structure, you've got these little very good players, a superstar, and a well-coached team against players in Mexico that aren't in form, against, a thriving Panamanian generation, against a hungry U.S. men's national team with, lots of players emerging. The region has grown. Generally, the Mexican public, the Mexican pundits, the Mexican team have lacked a bit of respect for the region because they've clearly dominated the region. And what I mean by dominated is they've only won one of the cycles since 1998. That was 2018 with Juan Carlos Osorio. Okay. But it's always been circumstantial, if you will. And they win Gold Cups and they win Confederations here and they do well there. But they've always dominated their rivals. They've had a clear dominance over the U.S. men's national team in what were competitive games for the last probably decade. They've had a clear dominance over Canada. They've had a clear dominance over Panama. No team in the region could really stake their claim for a dominance in competitive games like the way Mexico has. But they're starting to lose that chokehold they had on CONCACAF. Teams are starting not to fear them as much as they do. They still respect them, but they don't fear them.
And, speaking of being dominant in the region, again, scatterbrained Adrian, going back to the club level, they obviously have a stranglehold on the CONCACAF Champions League at the club level. But right. Previously, from I believe it was 98 to 2016, correct me if I'm wrong, they were competing in the Copa Libertadores. Right. So first of all, could you maybe explain to me why they ended up not playing in Libertadores anymore? And second of all, is there any money? Okay, simple, done. And is there any sort of correlation, do you think, between pulling out of that much more difficult continental competition in some ways versus how the national team is going, or no correlation really?
There is, because the majority of the players come from Liga MX. So if they're not getting the most competitive games possible, they're flatlining, so to speak, right? If your only expectation of getting a competitive game is playing against MLS clubs in the quarters, semis, or finals, that's a way to top your ceiling, You're going to grow stagnant. The reason they're not playing in Libertadores is money. Because believe it or not, in this country, and the United States is the key piece in pretty much everything that the Mexican Federation does, whether that's a club level or national team level, it's the key piece. They want a bigger share of the pie, a bigger piece of the pie. And CONMEBOL is like, no, we're not going to give you that piece of the pie. They understand what they bring to the table ratings-wise, and they want to be compensated for it. And CONMEBOL has drawn a pretty hard line and said, no, this is what you get, like any other team, any other league, you're not going to get any more. You're an invitee. You shouldn't get more than some of our other teams or other leagues. And Liga MX is like, okay, well, we just won't play. But it comes down to money. They clearly are, by the way, worth more than these South American teams in this country. If you look at ratings-wise, what soccer product does well in the United States, it's number one is not the Premier League. Number one is not the Champions League. It's not La Liga. It's Liga MX, and by a lot.
Yeah, I guess that population to tap into is just invaluable, especially for CONCACAF at this point now. So speaking of, tapping into markets, let's talk about the media in Mexico. Because when you look at national teams around the world, let's take in England, for example. They like to hype their team to oblivion, and they'll take every opportunity to sort of tear them down along the way, it seems. Yeah. So there's, our friend Filippo, tactical manager TV, of course. He'll say that being critical of the national team, you'll get labeled as toxic when it comes to the U.S. men's national team. So, Herc, how does the media affect the Mexican national side? Is there a similar dynamic to that of the States, or would it be closer to an England?
It would be exactly to an England. And It's funny that you brought that up because I use that example a lot. The parallels between English soccer and Mexican soccer are uncanny, especially when it comes to the press. They love to build you up. They will build you up. Next young Mexican talent, and they will say crazy things like Diego Lainez is going to be a Balón de Oro winner. They will say some outlandish things. But trust me, you don't do well, and you could be Javier Hernandez, the all-time leading goal scorer, Chicharito, the all-time leading goal scorer in Mexican national team history, and they will label him a tronco. say that he's not good with the ball, say that he's not technical, that he's a terrible player. They will crush you. To all ends, they are paparazzi-like as well. You have no personal life. You're under a microscope. Your family are also targets. Just recently, Chaca Rodriguez, the right back for the Mexican national team, and Memo Ochoa were targets. Their families, I should say, were targets of online abuse, death threats. It's par for the course around here. It's a very toxic scenario when it comes to the game, but because of how important the game is, not just to the press, not just to the fans, but to the very fabric that is everyday life in Mexico. I'll give you a few examples. First example is the Mexican national team plays. The country's paralyzed. Very few people are working. All eyes are set on the national team. Businesses operate around that. Revenue within these cities operate around that. That's one. The second would be when I played in Torreon for Santos Laguna, we played on a Friday night, 9:30. We had a very good team. Unbelievable team there. We won a championship and lost a CONCACAF Champions League final like in the same year. But if we did not get a good result that Friday night, that weekend, domestic violence would shoot up like 35% in the city. So it's crazy how involved they are with the team, how it affects their everyday well-being or mental status, if you will. It's a crazy way to look at the game. But unlike an England or a Brazil or a Portugal, how they treat the game, it's very similar. It's a crazy, I guess, mix of expectations and distorted reality when it comes to the press sometimes.
Yeah, it sounds like, as you're explaining it, that it becomes the central thing to not just the media, but to life in general of the population when Mexico is playing. That is, the pressure that must come along with that is just outstanding. I want to start wrapping things up here, and I wanted to get your take on, let's look at the top 3 teams in CONCACAF currently: Canada, USA, and Mexico. If you were to look at all things, infrastructure, youth that's coming through the ranks, the coaching, the current talent pool, etc., how would you rank them in this moment?
Oh, that's tough. That's tough because, okay, off of resources, both Mexico and the United States men's national team can do very well. And what I've learned from the Mexican Federation is they're very quick to adapt when they see the dollar dwindling down. They'll be very quick to change things, whatever keeps the buck going. And if they see that it's better for them to have their players go abroad, they'll change that very quickly. But as soon as the wallets hurt, and if they do that, I think it changes the game because their youth players are just better. They're just, honestly, they're more prepared. Technically, tactically, they eat, breathe, and sleep this. They live in this culture. That said, right now, I saw a graphic of the amount of players that are playing Champions League, Europa League, top 6, leagues in the world online recently, and the United States men's national team just completely obliterates like every country in this region. So easy money would be the U.S. men's national team, because the ceiling is higher. That would be, I guess, smart money. My intuition tells me Mexico will change things, and they're just better equipped, better set up. Every single one of their clubs and Ascenso, or what was Ascenso, and hopefully it'll come back, the second division with the right to be promoted, Liga de Expansión, all these different teams have academies, and they've got well set up academies, and they've been around for some clubs hundreds of years, so that tells me they've got a leg up there, especially when it comes to the player production, because they've been doing it. So if I had to bet, I would say right now the U.S. men's national team 1A, Mexico 1B, and everybody else in CONCACAF is kind of, I think maybe Canada has a leg up because they, in a sense, piggyback the U.S. market and its setup, the college program, which is also, part of the pyramid. They kind of piggyback on that. So they got a leg up on some of these other countries.
I think Canada is an interesting one. Obviously, I am biased, but I think Canada is an interesting one in that it's going to be interesting to see.
Are you Canadian?
I am Canadian, yes.
I did not know that. Where in Canada?
I'm in Montreal.
Okay, beautiful.
Yeah.
I lived in Toronto for a bit. Montreal's very nice.
Right, so our rivals.
That's right. Of course. Congratulations, you guys just won.
That's right, we did, yes. So I think, Canada is an interesting one in that it's going to be It's going to be very interesting to see, as how many times can I say interesting in the sentence? It's going to be interesting to see if they can keep this momentum going. And of course, it's looking promising with, the Canadian Premier League, the MLS teams, some of the talent that's starting to go across over to, Belgium and Tejan Buchanan, etc. So it's interesting to see what will happen with Canada.
If I could cut you off real quick, you reminded me of something. So something that happens that's very exclusive to Major League Soccer that probably doesn't happen with a lot of different national teams is, for example, Jordi Mihailovic. He's having a ridiculous season. Yeah. He's probably the top American playmaker right now in form. He can't get a sniff with the U.S. men's national team. That would never happen in Liga MX. If you had a player offensively who was playing that way, the clamor from the press would be thus that they would demand that he be called up instead of a Diego Lainez. He demand that he be called up instead of somebody who's in Europe. They put so much stock into Liga MX and what it is that if you are doing well internally, there's no way that can keep you away from the Mexican national team. And here it's almost the opposite, right? It's Major League Soccer. It's like we can't separate the two. We can't say good player, good moment, deserves a chance. Just, it doesn't happen. It's very unlikely to happen.
Absolutely. And it's something that you unfortunately see a lot in national teams in general, just that, these national team managers, they have their core of guys that they look to often. Like, it just gets ridiculous. And to see Mihailovic not get called once, the season he had with Montreal is just, it's baffling. It really is.
Yeah, I think if you take away the hockey assist, the double assist that Major League Soccer does, he's the top assist man in the league.
Yeah. My God. So let's wrap up here. Back to Mexico. If there were 2 to 3 changes that you were to make to the program, whether it be, to the grassroots, I think grassroots is doing fine. Infrastructurally, player selection, change of coach, whatever it may be. Let's say 3 changes you would make to improve the Mexican program over the next couple of years. What would those be?
Well, the first, I think it's imperative that you limit the number of foreigners that come into Liga MX. What that will do, it will be a chain reaction. You limit the amount of foreigners. So when I came into Liga MX, I believe it was 5 foreigners that you can have. And for a foreigner to get naturalized and count as a domestic player, they had to spend 10 seasons. So 5 years, 10 consecutive seasons, and they would earn their right to be like a Mexican national player, I should say, within Liga MX rules. What that meant is those who did stay were very good foreigners. And it incremented the level. It brought up the level of the Mexican players. And then the Mexican players who were there got an opportunity to play. So a lot of these guys, whether you started early or started late, proved their worth and became very good players, and some of them national team players. So when you do that, you concentrate highly on that pool of players that you have, and it gets stronger. But when you limit the foreigners, I really think the league gets better, the pool gets better, and Mexico will be better for it. That's one. 2 is I'd seriously have a conversation with Tata Martino about bringing back these blacklisted players, these vetados, because there's too many. Like it seems that he's a very strict coach, and if you cross him, you get in his crosshairs, you're out, you're done. We could talk about Arteaga, Layun, Chicharito. It just seems like there's so many different players that for whatever reason have been excommunicated from the national team. And right now, a player like Gerardo Arteaga, who's at Genk, who's getting minutes, who's a very good and very technical left back, could be playing instead of a Gallardo, and Gallardo's been just not very good. He's one of these players who hasn't been informed. So I would have a serious discussion about bringing in or introducing some of these players back into the pool. And 3 is I'd have a serious discussion with Tata Martino about the actual players that he's calling in. There are these sacred cows right now on the Mexican national team. Hector Herrera, who I'm a huge fan of, but it's no secret he's not in form and he's not getting time. Andres Guardado, who's 36 years old, Chucky Lozano, who's been in and out of form, Tecatito Corona, who's had his worst year as a professional that I could remember. Going down the list, you could say there are certain players who are still getting playing time, and maybe it'd be good to give them a rest. Let them sit out a game and regain that hunger, and call in some players who are doing very well in Liga MX. Players who could really do well for you who aren't getting a chance. Reyes from America, Ponchito Gonzalez from Monterrey, different types of players. Bring in Acevedo, the goalkeeper for Santos, who's like 22, 23 years old, instead of relying on a 36-year or 35-year-old Memo Ochoa, or a 39-year-old backup, a 35-year-old third goalkeeper. You know, it's like give new life to new players on the Mexican national team. If you do that with the amount of talent Mexico has and the way it's cultured with football, you'll be fine.
Yeah, so just to sum up, we're going to change the foreign player rule, limit them a little more.
Yes.
Start looking at the blacklisted players.
Yes.
Start moving towards a more meritocracy system as opposed to I trust you, you're in type of system.
Yeah. It says you're one of my sacred cows, you're a national team legend, you stay. You're unmovable, because that'll get you in trouble. And any national team, there has to be this generational change, and there's a reason that the Mexican national team is the oldest national team in CONCACAF right now.
Perfect. That's a perfect place to end. Herc, thank you so much, man. This honestly, it was a ton of fun, and I really, really do appreciate it.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks a lot, Adrian. I appreciate you giving me the space.
And there you have it. What a guy, hey? Truly a privilege to be able to speak with someone who I personally listen to so frequently. And a big thank you to my friend Filippo from Tactical Manager TV for helping set this conversation up. If you enjoyed this video, then drop a like for me. But other than that, thanks again to Herc for coming through, and enjoy your weekend, guys. Ciao.